Okay, welcome to another YouTube lecture. Let me just double check that we're recording. I keep doing this and I'm not recording, so there we go, we're good to go. Okay, important points in chapter 6. We're going to start this lecture by talking about chapter 6. That was your reading for this assignment. You may have missed that in the schedule just because I know we're jumping back and forth a lot. So if you did, go ahead and go back and read chapter 6. It's a long chapter, and I'm gonna just go over a few of the important points, things you don't want to miss from the chapter. So on page 23, it talks about what you should describe in a rhetorical analysis. It says you need to describe what you are analyzing. How much description you need depends on your subject, your audience, and the medium you've chosen to compose. Now, one thing we're going to talk about in this unit is summary, how much you should summarize the text and how much you should analyze the text. And this is a good answer to that question. You really only need to summarize or describe whatever you plan on analyzing. So you don't need to tell me everything that happens in the text you're analyzing, but you should just describe or quote the thing you are going to analyze. So if you're going to analyze one word, just quote one word. You don't need much more description than that. Many students will ask me if they need to describe the entire text before you start analyzing it. Give me a whole description of it or include it in some way. Now, because I am your audience, it's a surprise there because that's something we might not have talked about yet, and I will talk about that later in this PowerPoint. I will need some kind of knowledge of the text, meaning you need to give me a little bit of background, but I don't want you to spend much of your paper summarizing it for me. You can describe it in 3 to 4 sentences in your intro paragraph, like we talked about in the intro paragraph PowerPoint. And then beyond that, you can write your paper with the assumption that I have already read your text. Now, you're welcome to link your text in the comments section when you submit your paper if you have a link to it, but it's not necessary. I can grade your paper and read your paper without understanding everything in your text, especially if you write your paper well. Another thing you want to look for in chapter 6 is that there is a sample rhetorical analysis on page 74 and 75. Read over this to see a good example of how the author focuses on a rhetorical choice that Apple makes. So he talks about how they don't show visuals of computers in their commercials because it's really hard to see like details of a computer on a screen. And instead, they talk about small points that make their computers competitive. And he talks about how this rhetorical choice was effective for the audience. It always helps to read examples of what you're writing. There's a good one here. Last, the chapter talks about considering your rhetorical situation. So who is your audience? Now, your audience for this paper is me, and let me explain why. You are observing a rhetorical situation. Remember, you are not in the rhetorical situation of your text. You're not the author, you're not the audience, and the issue isn't your issue that they're talking about. You are just looking at the text as an observer and making an argument about whether or not the text is effective or ineffective. So if you're making an argument still, you need an audience for that argument. And because I'm the person reading your paper, we're going to make me your audience. So when you make choices, you're trying to persuade me that this text was overall effective or ineffective. Now, what is your argument? Either you have 2 choices for your argument, and I know we're being a little repetitive with this, but I want to be clear. You're either arguing that the argument you're observing is effective in persuading its intended audience, or that it is not effective in persuading its intended audience. That's it. You have 2 choices. You are making a claim about it being effective or ineffective overall. Like we talked about in the last PowerPoint, that doesn't mean the whole thing's perfect or the whole thing's total trash, like I put here. It can be a mix of effective or ineffective choices. The key is deciding if you think the author still persuaded his or her audience. So today we're going to talk about the power of the word, how to analyze diction, and what that means. Now, when you're watching this, we will already have talked about diction in class, but we're going to revisit it in a little bit more in depth because one of the biggest things I want you to take from this rhetorical analysis unit is how important it can be to choose the right individual words, how individual words can change the feeling and meaning of a text, and why these are a good tool to analyze. So, we're going to start by going to this really cool article I found called How Language Can Affect the Way We Think. This was originally a TED Talk by a man named Keith Chen. And he talks about how language affects our ability to save money. I'm actually going to link to this article in your assignment description if you want to go and read this yourself. He gives a lot of really cool examples, but the main one he talks about is how he noticed that the way we speak affects the way that we perceive reality. So he says in Chinese, you don't just say, "This is my uncle." You don't introduce your uncle to someone and say, "Hey, this is my uncle." The way you speak in Chinese requires that you include words and language, like you just have to for it to be grammatically correct, that tells us what side the uncle's on, if you're related to him by marriage or birth, and if it's your father's brother, whether he's older or younger. And he thought that was really interesting, and it just got him thinking about the connection between language and behavior. He designed a study that specifically looks at how language affects an individual's ability to save money. So he said, while futured languages like English distinguish between the past, present, and the future. So in our language, when we speak in the past tense, the present tense, or future tense. There are futureless languages like Chinese that use the same phrasing if you're talking about today, tomorrow, or yesterday, and you use context to understand that. But because they don't use language to differentiate specifically between past, present, and future, he found that people who speak these futureless languages are 30% more likely to report having saved money in any given year, meaning they will have saved 25% more by retirement, which is just crazy. Like that's an insane amount of money. And this was a really interesting conclusion to him, that just the language you speak with no other, differences can change the way a person saves money. He found that this was probably because when you're not talking like the future is this distant thing like we do in English, when we talk about the future, it feels very far away. When you don't talk about the future because like it's far away, it feels more imminent, and you're much more likely to feel like you need to save for the future because it doesn't feel as far away. I will link to this article. There are 4 other really interesting studies done here about how the way we speak can affect behavior. And when I read this article, I found it really interesting that if words are this important, that the way we speak can affect everything from the way we save money. If you read those studies, you'll see it even affects the way we perceive color, the way our eyes see, the way we lay blame. The words we use to lay blame actually affect prison systems and the amount of people incarcerated in a country. If words are this important, then it's really important to pay attention to how we use words when we're trying to persuade others, right? If they're that important and they affect behavior, then in a paper where we're trying to persuade someone to change their behavior, words feel especially important. And when we're analyzing a paper for its effectiveness in changing behavior, we can definitely and should definitely look at individual word choices. So, language shapes our sense of reality. This comes from a man named Brian Jackson, who argues that the words we use shape the way we perceive reality. He talks about a study done on high school students in regard to their first sexual experience. So there was a group of people doing a study, and they were trying to find out at what age students had their first sexual experience. But when they were getting these written reports back in, they found that according to peers, meaning either male or female responses, everyone was using almost the same language. So the majority of the time when someone, male or female, was talking about a high school boy's first sexual experience, the responder said that he had sex. While when a responder, male or female, was talking about a high school girl's first sexual experience, they used the language, she lost her virginity. And they unintentionally formed a really different conclusion from this study. They were trying to just look at age, but what they found actually is that the way we view this experience for boys and girls socially is very different, and they learned that just from our language. A boy has something. Had is a possessive term. It's empowering to have something. A girl lost something. There's a lot more emotions connected with loss, and it's a lot more vulnerable and weak. And they reframed their entire study just based on the words people were using unintentionally to describe the same event. Now, we of course want to be responsible, but we should also be strategic in the words we choose in order to make a point. So there might be a difference between the words happy, cheerful, pleased, and glad. And we don't want to be emotionally manipulative in the words we choose, but it does matter which word we choose. I had a teacher in high school who would use the phrase, there is no such thing as a synonym. And what she meant by that is that no matter what word we choose, there's a slightly different meaning, a slightly different tone. So even though two words, or these four words here on the screen, might be viewed as synonyms, meaning they have similar meanings, they have a lot, we connect differently to those words. If a person is glad, that's a lot different than a person being pleased. And we culturally and socially understand the differences. So if we're talking about diction, it's important to define first what that term means. The basic definition is that it's just the choice and use of words and phrases in speech or writing. So we might say Wordsworth campaigned against exaggerated poetic diction. Whenever we're talking about diction, it's word choice, and so you can't just say the author used diction, right? We've talked about this before. You have to say what kind of diction the author used. Otherwise, you're just saying the author used words. Great. It's great the author used words. What kind of words did this author use? Did the author use angry diction? Did the author use descriptive diction or emotional diction or pleasant diction? What kind of words are you analyzing here? You're looking for specific words chosen when you're analyzing diction. You're not, sometimes I see students say the author used diction and then they will go, or a specific type of diction, and then they will quote an entire phrase, or they'll talk about the tone overall. If you're analyzing the author's diction, you need to talk about and quote individual specific words, single words. Now, one thing you can look at in your analysis is the connotation of a word an author uses versus the denotation. So the denotation is just the literal meaning of the word. If the author said, the project was really cool, now we know the denotation of the word cool. It means cold, right? The literal meaning of the word cool is cold. But the connotation is all the other implications or associations we attach with a word. So, and that one's pretty clear to us. We know that the connotation of that word is it was awesome or good or socially acceptable. examples, the word cool, the word killer. It's kind of a dumb example, but if your friend says, oh, that's a killer jacket, you don't think that that jacket is going to strangle you. That's the denotation of that word. You understand the connotation. We like to use the example of a house versus a home. The denotation of both these words is the same, right? It's the literal meaning, it's a place that you live. But the connotations of house versus home are very different, right? House is cold. It's a way you describe a place that you just bought. We bought a house, right? Home has a warm feeling, and it's a place where you have memories, and your home is a place where you feel safe. There's all those feelings attached to that word. The same with mother versus mom. You might use mother if you're upset with your mom, or it's a very formal term. My mother asked me to do that is formal. We say my mom. Mom is endearing, and it's a connective word that has a different connotation. Now, I want you to spend some time thinking about words, thinking about why words are important. And specifically when you're analyzing, I want you to look at connotations of words. In an analysis, you might say something like, the author used this word because it reminds the reader of blank. The author used the words concoct because that word suggests that it's kind of sciencey and it's haphazard, and it suggests that not a lot of time was put into this plan. And so they use that word to subtly suggest that the plan they're talking about was not well thought out, right? Talk about why a word was chosen and all the connotations and things a reader might associate with it. So, to complete this assignment, you're going to watch a video. Now, I will link this video in the assignment description. It is a video of it's a sports movie. It comes from the sports movie Miracle. It's a speech given by the coach right before his team goes to play the big Soviets, right? Which is what Russia was in 1984, I think, is when this happened. And this, is just kind of a famous movie speech. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to watch this speech, and while you're watching, I want you to make a list of as many words as you can that were specifically chosen to persuade. After the video, you're going to write one paragraph where you talk about why these words were chosen. So what kind of feeling overall was Coach Brooks hoping to create by using these words? And then I want you to pick one word that you think was most persuasive and explain why. So you should write about a paragraph of explanation. You're going to submit this list of words and your paragraph of explanation in the submission form for this assignment, and when you do submit it, you will receive attendance points for the day. We will talk more about analyzing words and how to do this, but right now I just want to get you thinking about words and why authors specifically chose them. As always, you can email me with questions.